Jehovah's Witnesses and Christians alike right now are becoming pretty afraid right now because they see what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, and they believe that it is prophetic. I'm going to explain to you why I do not necessarily think that it's prophetic. And this is going to be me being honest, about what I think, not trying to sway anyone, not trying to be underhanded. But I do have some objections to the witnesses, and I'm going to be very open and honest about that. So I don't want any Jehovah's Witnesses watching this thinking that I'm trying to slyly slide this in here, because I'm not. I'm going to tell you outright, I do not think that it's prophetic, and I'm going to explain why I don't think it's prophetic. So if you go to jw.org lately, given the whole crisis between Russia, supposedly invading Ukraine, they think that this is basically a sign of the last days. In their article, they talk about how it's a sign of the last days. This is fulfillment of prophecy, and that Russia is the king of the north. And I'm going to go through that article real quick and dissect some objections that I have to this article, because I feel like the article is very misleading, and I feel like if you're not careful, you can be suckered into another false prophecy, because the Jehovah's Witnesses and other Christian groups alike have made through their years many, prophecies that have never come true. I believe that this is another event happening that is applied to prophecy, or that they apply prophecy to this that simply is not substantiated. So let's get into this article real quick. Russia invades Ukraine. Now, like I said, this is on jw.org. Now, I do have a right to discuss this. jw.org, this is free speech, and this is fair use. So this is going to be some of my honest criticism of this article. So here it goes, right here on the home page. Russia invades Ukraine. Is Bible prophecy being fulfilled? So it's a short article, and I'm not going to get into every single aspect of it or every single scripture. You're more than welcome to look that up for yourself, which is why I've cited where it's at. So, Russia invades Ukraine. In the early morning hours of February 24th, 2022, Russia began a military invasion of Ukraine despite the efforts of world leaders to avoid war. How might this military conflict affect the world? The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said a few days ago, "The price in human suffering, destruction, and damage to European and global security is too high to contemplate." Now, I don't disagree with that. But what I do object to, or what I'm skeptical of, is that it's prophetic. So, Jesus Christ foretold a time when nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Now, already I have an objection to this, because the scripture cited is Matthew 24:7. Now, Matthew 24:7 talks about the last days. But what last days are we talking about when we're talking about the last days that Jesus referred to in Matthew chapter 24? Well, he talked about the destruction of Jerusalem. He talked about the events that are supposedly, allegedly prophetic, even though that they were actually written after the fact, supposedly. According to most scholars, Matthew 24 was written after Jerusalem was already destroyed. So then my question to that would be, well, then how is it prophetic if it was written after the fact? But let's say it was prophetic. Let's just go ahead and give the Bible credit here and say it actually was prophetic. I still do not think that it applies to today, because Jesus was very descriptive in what would happen to the destruction of Jerusalem. He gave no evidence that it had any kind of further application. So to me, that debunks it right there. To me, we could stop right there. But for the sake of it, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about this. Matthew chapter 24 is what the witnesses applied to the generation of 1914, that Armageddon would not come until the generation of 1914 saw all the events that would indicate that we're in the last days. Well, that generation did die. So right out right out of the gate. Either Jesus is wrong or the Jehovah's Witnesses are wrong. Or should I say the governing body's interpretation of the scripture is wrong. It doesn't really apply because there is no further application described at all. And as descriptive as Jesus was in Matthew chapter 24, we have no reason to assert and assume or connect dots that aren't there, especially by an uninspired governing body, one that admits and says even in their own literature that they are uninspired and not infallible, which means that they can make mistakes. So we have no reason to really listen to them here when they try to apply Matthew chapter 24 about the situation going on between Russia and Ukraine. Point blank, period, and for any reason whatsoever. But let's go further in this article. The Bible book of Revelation depicts warfare as a rider who is seated on a fiery colored horse and who takes peace away from the earth. Okay, so Revelation 6:4 is cited. It talks about the fiery horseman. Again, this is not very descriptive. Now, it talks about the last days and all these things that are going to happen before God's kingdom sets in. But we've already seen nuclear attacks. We've already seen all kinds of wars throughout the centuries. This is over 2,000 years in the making. So what reason do we have to believe, especially if there is no description here, and this is being spouted by an uninspired governing body, that this is prophetic in any way? What reason do we have? The book of Daniel foretold a rivalry between King of the North and the King of the South. Now, this is one that I want to describe a little bit. Okay, so anyone who's read the book of Daniel knows that it talks about kingdoms coming in. It talks about, Babylon. It talks about the Medo-Persians. And then it talks about the king of Greece. So I'm going to read some of this because this is long. 25 through 45, Daniel chapter 11. And he will muster up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a large army, and the king of the south will prepare himself for the war with an exceedingly large and mighty army. And he will not stand, because they will plot schemes against him. And those eating his delicacies will bring his downfall. As for his army, it will be swept away, and many will fall down slain. As regards the two kings, their heart will be inclined to do what is bad, and they will sit at one table speaking lies to each other. But nothing will succeed, because the end is yet for the appointed time. He will go back to his land with a great amount of goods, and his heart will be against the holy covenant. He will act effectively and go to his land. At the time appointed, he will return and come against the south, but this time will not be as before. For the ships of Kittim, now this is another indication that this does not apply to the last days. There are no ships of Kittim, will come against him, and he will be humbled. He will go back and hurl denunciations against the holy covenant and act effectively, and he will go back and will give attention to those leaving the holy covenant, and arms will stand up proceeding from him, and they will profane the sanctuary, the fortress, and remove the constant feature. And they will put in place the disgusting thing that causes desolation. And those who act wickedly against the covenant, he will lead into apostasy by means of smooth words. But the people will know their God and prevail and act effectively. In short, when you go down to the bottom of this, he talks about Edom and Moab. He will enter into the land of decoration, and many lands will be made to stumble, but these are the ones that will escape out of his hand. Edom and Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites. He will keep thrusting out his hand against the lands, and as regards the land of Egypt, she will not escape. And he will rule over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over all the desirable things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians will be at his steps. But we're talking about Russia and Ukraine here. You see, so here's the problem with this scripture, and this is where I believe the governing body is connecting dots that aren't there. They're trying to apply prophecy to ancient scripture. Now, a lot of scholars who have studied the book of Daniel think that it was written after the fact anyways, which is why it could make what happened to the Medes and the Persians and Greece look prophetic, as if it actually was prophetic, when in reality it was probably written after the fact, and they tried to make it look prophetic. We got further evidence of that because Daniel could not describe the kings after that with any kind of description, if Daniel even wrote this. You don't hear about the kings of America and Great Britain. He doesn't say anything about the future because he didn't know anything about the future, because it didn't exist in the time that he wrote it. And the things that happen with Greece and the Medes and Persians probably happened after the fact, and he wrote them to make them look more prophetic anyways. So you need to be careful what you're putting your trust in. As they say, and as it says in the Bible, you don't put your trust in every word. You don't. And that includes the Bible, unfortunately. If we're being real about this, that also includes the Bible. Because it can't go into any description, especially since it's supposed to be an inspired book, the kingdoms that came afterward, the kingdoms that we are living in. And if it can't describe the kingdoms that we are living in the time of today, then why should we think that Russia and Ukraine somehow applies? That's my point. We have no reason to, especially if they're going to use anything from Matthew chapter 24 in here, which is the generation of 1914, the generation that was not supposed to die, the generation that was supposed to witness Armageddon, who never did, who died. It makes no sense. And it's not that you're crazy if you're not understanding this. It's not that I'm crazy. It's not that, oh, well, you just don't have enlightenment or fulfillment. No, it's that it genuinely doesn't make sense, and that a lot of dots that don't need to be connected are being connected here that shouldn't be being connected. So this is why I'm very skeptical, and I feel like it's very misleading of Watchtower to try to use this to scare people to come back to the organization, or to come into the organization by connecting dots that aren't there. To me, this is very shady. This is very dishonest. And I personally have a lot of skepticism about it, and I don't like it. So that's really all that I had to say about this. There is a lot more in this article. I have not described everything in this article. I haven't gone through every paragraph, but you get enough to kind of get the juices flowing. Hopefully this will kind of make you a little bit skeptical about what Watchtower is just hand feeding you, because a lot of dots are being connected here that the Bible gives no description about. The Bible's very vague about all this, and Watchtower and a lot of Christians are applying things and putting things into this that simply are not applicable in the Bible. They're filling in the blanks. They're putting details in there that aren't there. And if these men admit that they are uninspired, then you got to ask yourself, how highly should I regard their opinion over my own skepticism, over my own critical thought process that if God is real, God gave me? Because he says not to put your trust in nobles anyway. So why would you put your trust in nobles, especially nobles that admit they are uninspired and not infallible? I think that's about all that I had to say about it. I just wanted to share this with you tonight. And that's really it. So you're more than welcome to go back to this yourself. I encourage you guys to read the book of Matthew, especially Matthew chapter 24. Read the book of Daniel, especially Daniel chapter 11. Study this article and use the critical thinking and decide for yourself.